Well, good afternoon, everybody. Dobar večer. You're all very welcome indeed to this special event on the Bulgarian parliamentary election. My name is John O'Brennan. I am the director of the Maynooth Centre for European and Eurasian Studies at Maynooth University in Ireland. And we are delighted to host this event today. Many of you will know our work. We are the only such academic centre on the island of Ireland that focuses on Central, Eastern and Southeastern Europe. We're also a Jean Monnet Centre of Excellence. And over the course of the semester, we have been examining a whole range of issues that impact significantly on Southeastern Europe, including a session on the rule of law within the European Union and the various controversies attached to that. Most recently, we looked at Slovenia and the things that the Janša administration has been doing there. And it's a great pleasure today to move our focus to Bulgaria. It's especially a pleasure for me because I started my working life as an academic working in Bulgaria at the Varna Economics University. So in a way, I made that journey from the westernmost part of Ireland, Limerick, where I was then, to the easternmost part of the European Union. And I very much hope that one of the things we're doing in hosting these events is to encourage not just academic activity, but public communication around the European Union and around our various memberships, and in improving collaborations across disciplines and across member state boundaries. A word about our speakers before we begin. It's a pleasure indeed for me to introduce these two colleagues who I've known and admired for many years. Firstly, Dr. Dimitar Bechev is a senior fellow with the Atlantic Council and with the Institute for Human Sciences in Vienna. Dimitar's work on the geopolitics of Southeastern Europe in particular is really well known. He holds a doctorate from Oxford University. He has been a visiting fellow at the London School of Economics and at Harvard University, most recently at the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill. And he is about to publish very shortly his new book on Turkey, which is, I think, highly anticipated. It comes out with Yale University Press later in the year. I think Dimitar had the great satisfaction a few weeks ago of sending off the final proofs, which is always a great moment for any author. His book, Rival Power, looks at Russia's relationships in Southeastern Europe and its presence, and it is an invaluable work, to say the least. Our second speaker this afternoon, again, needs little introduction. Professor Anna Krasteva is one of Bulgaria's most senior academics. She's a professor at the Department of Political Sciences at the New Bulgarian University. She's also the founder and director of the Center for Refugees, Migration and Ethnic Studies. She's the author of more than 30 books and edited books, 100 articles on a range of themes ranging from refugees, asylums, the presence of far-right impulses within our society, and the importance also of civic mobilizations of different kinds. She's also doing an extraordinary job as editor-in-chief of the journal Southeastern Europe, which helps to bring so much that's important about the region to a global audience. So I am delighted that both Dimitar and Anna are able to join us today. I'm really looking forward to our discussion about the election. I'd also like to welcome our participants this afternoon, in particular colleagues from the Bulgarian Embassy in Dublin and from the Irish Embassy in Bulgaria, working hard on both fronts to improve relations between our two countries. Indeed, it is notable that in the 4th of April election, And I suppose reflecting the number of people from Bulgaria who have come to Ireland in recent years, we saw a doubling of the number of people who actually voted in the election. There were 4 regional centres where Bulgarian citizens could vote: in Dublin, Cork, Ennis, in County Clare, and in Tullamore. And I think that is indicative of a growing relationship between the two countries. So with that, I'd like to perhaps open our discussion. I'll put my first question, if I could, to Dimitar, and then Anna will come back. And it is really about what you believe to be the most important takeaways from this election, whether it is the reduced number of seats for GERB, the ruling party, the extraordinary appearance of a new party led by Slavi Trifonov, ITN, or the correspondingly relatively disappointing performance of the Bulgarian Socialist Party. What do you think, Dimitar, is the most important set of things that we might take out of the recent election?
Thank you, John, and thanks for this opportunity as well as for the generous introduction. I think it's a combination of the three, although with your last point, the decline of the Socialist Party, this is not something that is striking. We've seen it for a long, long time. I'll definitely single out GERB's decline, because in the early days, 2009, when they came to power, they used to win about twice as many votes in numerical terms than now. So that's a 50% decline, and of course their support has been eroding for quite some time, but now they're in a structurally very different position that they have ever been. Secondly, in the past 2 elections, 2017 and 2014, they always had somebody to coalesce with, which is not the case now. And well, what we have is a situation where everybody's ganging up against GERB, and for a good reason, I should add. And lastly, your question about Slavi Trifonov. I don't think that's something new, in the sense that those anti-systemic parties have been the norm in Bulgarian politics since 2001. So populism that we discussed at length in consolidated democracies is not a novel phenomenon by any measure in Bulgaria. I would argue it's the norm, the normal. Indeed, Borisov emerged as a populist, and since his arrival on the scene, you had many others. I mean, it's a long list. I need not bother people, and I see lots of familiar names in the audience, so they are perfectly aware of the ins and outs of Bulgarian politics. So having one more personality of this caliber is not a surprise. What's probably striking is the extent of his electoral success. And then I'll leave it for later, the discussion, what we make out of, how we move forward, and how Slavi Trifonov will capitalize on his success at the ballot.
2020 was a year characterized in Bulgaria, obviously like everywhere else, by the COVID crisis, although in Bulgaria the crisis came later in the year and not really during the first wave. However, there were all those scandals associated with GERB, which took up a lot of attention. And then we had a serious protest movement that began in the summertime and then extended into the autumn. How important do you think the protests were in mobilizing people, or did they even really succeed in mobilizing people? And were they the kind of people that ended up voting for ITN or for Democratic Bulgaria or for the new stand-up Mafia Out party?
Yeah, 2 elements in your elaborated question or comment. So elections during COVID. This is the first really important peculiarity of the elections, that they did not deal with the COVID almost not at all, but with the corruption. So that a major topic, which is the public opinion is always sensitive, but it is really absolutely amazing to see during a very serious COVID crisis with a very high rate of mortality, etc. People first mobilized and then, let's say, voted for anti-corruption program. This is the first element. The second, really, it was clearly demonstrated by these elections. Street mobilizations do matter. Citizens' mass protest did matter. The protest itself, it is interesting really to comment, probably more details later. But let's say the impact is extraordinary because they reshaped the Bulgarian party system. It is not the same anymore, so we could always measure how many votes here and there, but the whole political scene is different with 3 protest parties. Which according to me is a good news, so that we do not pass from one charismatic leader to another one, but we have 3 voices of the mass protest, which have been very heterogeneous as all mass protests, so that there were a few, let's say, major aims of the protest, but let's say the public and the specific aims of different groups, of course, varied very much. I would really like to elaborate a little bit more on the protest, but it's up to you to indicate what time, let's say, fits, let's say, to this specific problematic. But
well, one of the points that Dimitar raises, obviously, is that these new parties are anti-system parties, but they're not new in Bulgaria. They have appeared at different junctures regularly. But in the person, particularly of Slavi Trifonov, I was reminded that back in 2001, the former king Simeon was perceived by many as the new Messiah. And of course, in 2009, that was the kind of figure that Boyko Borisov was presented by as some. Both of those movements, if they promised real change, don't seem to have really impacted very significantly on Bulgaria. So why should we believe that this anti-system vote is going to really produce anything within Bulgarian politics that changes the dial fundamentally?
I would introduce probably a nuance. I would not agree that all 3 parties are anti-systemic parties. There is Democratic Bulgaria, which is the voice of the urban middle class intellectuals, etc., with the very pro-European, very expert, let's say, really capital in expertise, with the very solid agenda. So the only problem of this party is that it is so elitist in this structure, and that it does not succeed to win more votes, but it is definitely not an anti-systemic party. I am not sure. We have to see how they vote, what do they do once they pass from politics to policy, but the new anti-mafia party also, because there are some politicians there who used to be for long years members of the Bulgarian Socialist Party. So again, okay, not anti-systemic. So Slavi Trifonov party does, let's say, correspond to this profile. So I think what is really, according to me, the most important to stress again and again, it is the anti-corruption, anti-state capture agenda, and not to underestimate the differences, political, ideological differences among the 3, let's say, new political actors who entered the parliament. Democratic Bulgarian is not new, but as a coalition, it is a new coalition of existing parties, again with green and pro-European and center-right agenda, which is a solid pure of reforms.
Thank you very much. Dimitar, if I may come back to you on GERB in particular. However badly it may have done compared to the breakthrough in 2009 or even last time, they still emerged with 50% more seats than their nearest rival, almost double the number of seats of the Bulgarian Socialist Party. So does that suggest that GERB is kind of deeply implanted? They also won in many of the multi-seat constituencies. So does it mean that some of the obituaries that have been written for GERB are really kind of premature, that GERB is going to continue, with or without Boyko Borisov, to be an important force in Bulgarian politics in the years to come? Just your mute button, sorry.
There are several aspects to your question. First one is his personality, because at the end of the day, it's a leadership party. He doesn't have any structure beyond Borisov's charisma. And what we know about Borisov, based on previous challenges he had to deal with, is that he's a survivor. And I mean, of course, you can argue his mojo is running out and he may have lost the plot to a degree, but you should give him credit. He's an intuitive politician, and there's a good chance that he'll navigate the crisis. Having said that, it's important to look at the structure of the GERB vote. And again, with the caveat that I'm not a political sociologist by any measure, but it's obviously drawing support from not just rural areas, but also small towns. And there's a school of thought in Bulgaria suggesting that the reason GERB is successful is because it has all the benefits of the incumbency.
Yeah.
If you control the state's apparatus and also the clientelistic networks around the state and the financial resources, you're bound to benefit from the so-called controlled votes. And it's a long discussion, and maybe we'll come back to it later in the conversation. And in a scenario where you actually have a rerun of the vote in a couple of months' time, but at the same time we have a caretaker government appointed by the president, this hypothesis will be put to the test. In other words, if GERB is outside power, how much of their vote is contingent on them being in control. There is a footnote, of course, that they have power at the local level. Even when they were outside government in 2013, 2014, in the Oresharski period, GERB was not really in opposition because they were so much embedded at the local level. But we might have a similar situation now. And again, there are those saying that GERB has, because of Borisov's skills and X number of factors, have the resilience and they'll retain their share. But also there are others suggesting that they might be in trouble, and in a rerun of the elections, they might lose even more support.
Anna, you wanted to come back in on that point, yes.
Yeah, it's always interesting to offer slightly different interpretations of the same phenomena. So first, to start with the profile of let's say, the two clienteles. So GERB is in such a strong position because it developed during the years two clienteles, and they are a really important part of its electorate. One in the public sector, another one in the private sector. So in the public sector, for more than 10 years in power, the public administration is very much dominated, let's say, by civil servants, or appointed directly or connected politically with GERB at all levels, so national, regional, and local level. So this is the first very, very big clientele. The second in the private sector is the firms, the companies which get European funds because they are selected and so that we come to the state capture. I'll not go into details. But let's say they are supposed, how to say, to make the same service or to invite, let's put it this way, also their employees, their workers, let's say, to vote to the party which, let's say, is so generous bringing this funds. So being in opposition, it would be a kind of a precedent in GERB's experience for a few years, not a few months or a year, but let's say 4 more years, would allow us, the observers, but also the electorate, the citizens, to realize the size of these clienteles, because let's say they would diminish considerably, and we'll see, let's say, more clearly the real core of the electorate of GERB, which I guess would be much, much smaller. My nuance, let's say, to Dimitar's interpretation is that GERB does have a very strong structures at all levels, so national, regional, and local levels. This is also, how to say, GERB is not associated with any ideology. They are members of the European, let's say, People's Party. They are very unproblematic, let's say, members, so that not Orban style, etc. So that the affiliation of the electorate, but also of the members, let's say, does not follow the line of values or ideology specific or party, let's say, a strong identity. It is associated with a party in government, party of power, distributing resources, etc., but really with very, very strong structures. So here comes, how to say, the leadership, because also the public, but the party thought that these structures were very much controlled by the second in the party, Tsvetan Tsvetanov. And once he left, so that everybody expected, let's say, some problems. It was during the European elections. And it happened that, let's say, Boyko Borisov succeeded really mobilizing the party. But again, thanks, let's say, to the structures. And the last example, we could elaborate a lot, so that, let's say, this strength at local level, it has also a party visibility. So deputy chairs of the party are the mayors of the mayor of Sofia and the mayor of Burgas, one of the biggest city, quite successful, let's say, GERB mayors. But and so that they became, so that they got promoted in the party hierarchy because of the fact that they were, let's say, good mayors. But the last election, so the ones we are discussing now, so that the results are not good. So that Sofia is a big win for democratic Bulgaria. Two of the 3 electoral districts are already won by democratic Bulgaria. It is a huge, huge, huge both political and symbolic loss for GERB. Just to remind the audience that at the beginning of the democratic transitions, decades ago, 3 decades ago, the change took time, so that was much slower than most of us expected, but it started by the capital and the big cities. So that first it is a loss, a really huge political loss of the capital, but the second symbolically where the change is produced, so that you lose the core of the change. And in the next party conference, Boyko Borisov already declared that the position of those 2 mayors, okay, will be discussed, etc.
Thank you very much, Hannah. Dimitar, can I come back to you and just make an observation about Ireland? I find Bulgarian friends are often quite downcast because Bulgaria often comes in last or near to last in the things that really matter, whether it's vaccine distribution or other kinds of indicators. But I'm reminded where people ask, what did the European Union do? What did EU membership actually change about the fundamentals of politics, the economy, society? After 15 years of membership, I could state categorically in 1988, Ireland was a basket case. We hadn't taken advantage of our membership of the European community. We had run huge deficits, high debt levels. 50,000 people a year left Ireland every year through the 1980s. So it's kind of comparable in some senses until we came to our senses at the end of the 1980s and began to do things differently. And I would say also different forms of corruption were part of that experience in the 1970s and 80s. And thinking about this most recent election, I wondered whether this was ultimately, although there was a kind of stasis produced out of it, it would prove a game changer in the longer term. And I wonder what your feeling about that is, given that you know the European context so well. And I might ask about what role the European Union might play in Bulgaria's future in the years to come.
Well, that's a very good question, and I have just several very brief points. First of all, I'm definitely of the view that this reshuffle, the instability it produces, is preferable to the stagnation we experienced over the past decade. Even if short-term turbulence is in order, and you have a repeat election, who knows, maybe even an Israel scenario of recurrent elections. Even if there is cost attached to that, it's better than the stasis. And we can discuss at length the diagnose, what went wrong in Bulgaria and why. The problem looking at the EU is that the EU became sort of part of the problem, just to be the devil's advocate, not the solution. In the 90s and especially in the 2000s, during the pre-accession period, the EU was the missing external anchor, compensating for whatever deficit in terms of accountability and reform commitments you had at the elite level. But after Bulgaria made it in, the EU obviously lost much of its authority or powers to promote this kind of governance and rule of law reforms. What we had instead of, as a substitute, was this cooperation verification mechanism. As you know, and pretty much everybody who has studied this part of the world or the issue of the rule of law, it has proven dysfunctional. And the EU was reduced to just this money box feeding corruption and clientelism in Bulgaria. And it's not only about Bulgaria, but also the general context has changed. EU as a whole lost much of its liberal democratic zeal. There was a good article in The Economist commenting on that. I mean, the EU is an instrument at the end of the day. And given the change in the zeitgeist, it turned into this instrumental machine in the hands of the likes of Orban and the rest. And of course, there are lots of differences between Hungary and Bulgaria, but the point still stands. It's not for nothing that these days you see the likes of Matteo Salvini or even Marine Le Pen changing their views of the EU. Now they are pro-European because they see the benefits of being in charge of this machine. So the question is, if the EU cannot do the job of disciplining elites and ensuring accountability, what do we have? And I think that's why you have this emergence of civic energy as a compensatory mechanism. And I think it's a healthier situation in the sense that at the end of the day, the democratic system or democracy is negotiated at home. It's not a Brussels level affair. I mean, of course, the EU can have a predictive role there, can align with certain forces, can encourage and set the normative horizon, but it's up to the voters and to the citizens to decide on those matters. And I guess, I mean, even this period of instability now makes things worse. It's worth trying because, I mean, the alternative is not very encouraging. It's pretty disheartening what we had for the past decade, going full circle to where I started.
Yeah, thank you. And Anna, you wanted to come back in, yes.
Yeah, I would like to add another angle, so to look at the European integration through the eyes not of the elite. Dimitar developed this aspect very well, but the eyes of citizens. As paradoxically as it may seem, Bulgarian citizens do consider Brussels as its major ally against the corrupted elites. So those reports, I'm not saying that every Bulgarian adores, let's say, Brussels bureaucracy or reads the reports, but what the reports criticize in the functioning of the Bulgarian democracies, citizens criticize or on the streets or on social media or in different other, let's say, types of mobilizations, etc. And so that this observation is valid all the time, but it becomes crystal clear during really high moments of mobilization. So last summer, we saw a kind of a triangle of citizens in the streets, and I'll come to that who those citizens were, because some of them were coming back, let's say, from the European countries of studies or work, etc. Okay, so citizens from one side, at that time there was a critical report from Brussels and there was another critical report from Washington. So the two most important capitals spoke the same language as the people in the street. And the third element of those of this triangle were the most prominent Bulgarian voices in art. Georgi Gospodinov, Teddy Ushev, the best names of Bulgarian art with international global reputation, etc., with all their individualities, so that it was not easy for them, let's say, to write a common text, open letter, and to sign with let's say, the slogans of the protest. So European Union is really the best which happened to Bulgaria in the recent history. And I come very briefly to the second aspect. What the average Bulgarian really adores in the fact that Bulgaria is a member state is the possibility of mobility. So mobility for work, mobility for education, mobility for everything, so that the freedom of mobility, let's say after decades of a closed country, the freedom of mobility, of course, which in several cases is migration, it is an asset of citizens who do not want to live in our country, but okay, so try their chances abroad. It is not by chance that so many succeed abroad because of a more meritocratic system. And the real last elements, so that we do see these two faces of the Bulgarian nations. So the ones living in Bulgaria, like myself, also traveling a lot, and the other one, like Dimitar, working on Bulgaria, but living abroad with a permanent address abroad. I am very mobile, but my permanent address is in Sofia, a city I love very much. Okay, but those Bulgarians abroad, so that they this time really demonstrated how responsible engaged citizens of Bulgaria they are, queuing. I don't know photos from let's say Dublin, but there were photos from London queuing for 3-4 hours for voting at the elections. Most or some of them could not cast their vote. Okay. But let's say this mobilization, so those Bulgarians who left Bulgaria, they stay connected with the country and they do like to contribute, let's say, to the change of the country. And the last detail, so that if the government was to be, let's say, formed on the basis of the votes from abroad, there would have been no problem because the majority of the votes of the Bulgarians abroad are for the three protest parties. So the government would not be a problem, etc. So that they do have a different, let's say, political profile, but they are getting more and more engaged in, let's say, Bulgaria. And this is also one of the advantages of living as a European state.
I should point out also that of my generation in the 1980s, of young Irish people who left because they had no prospect of a job or having any kind of successful career or life, many of them did begin to come back in the 1990s, and they have really made a difference. Like Bulgaria, our country has experienced these different waves of outward migration at different periods, but people have come back when they've had a signal that there has been real change in the country, either social change or political change. And that's one of the questions I have about this election, about whether it might motivate the really talented Bulgarian people who have left for Amsterdam and Berlin and other places. What signal do they need to come home? And there is a difference here, I think, is there between Sofia, which is a very prosperous European city now, and rural Bulgaria, just like many parts of rural France or Ireland or other places which are not doing as well as cities. And I wonder about the capacity of the country to actually attract back enough of these people who have accumulated extraordinary life experiences in industry or education or whatever the area might be, and would be real assets to their communities when they come back. And that brings me, Dimitar, if I could, just to talk about the near future and what happens now constitutionally. You mentioned that the most likely outcome is a new election. It may come actually rather soon. And I wonder if you would talk us through that, conscious that not everybody will be aware of the constitutional parameters. What is likely to happen, do you think, over the next couple of months? Again, you just have to unmute.
Yeah, sorry. Well, obviously, GERB will be given the mandate by President to form a government. From everything, it looks as if GERB won't be successful. So in the next week, we'll know that Slavi Trifonov, who is the second group in Parliament, we have a goal, and that's the big question: whether Trifonov will be able to assemble coalition. The chances are not great because he doesn't have enough seats, and then I mean, that's where it gets really interesting. The president will have to give it to a third group to form government. Now, if number one and number two have failed, it's very clear that the third group won't be successful either. But the twist here is that the parliament will have enough time to legislate. So some crucial legislative changes might be passed in the short existence of this parliament, including, most pressingly, changes to the electoral code to enable voting abroad. For instance, electronic voting, something that has been discussed ad nauseum for a long time. Forming a separate electoral district for Bulgarians abroad in order to maximize their say. Abolishing paper ballots, which will have implications as to controlled vote. We don't need to get into all the shenanigans, how you manipulate voting, video surveillance in the sections. And it's a long list. It seems to me there is a consensus amongst the three so-called protest parties on this note. They want to do it. Whether they'll manage to get some votes from elsewhere, whether the establishment parties want to support it, those changes, which might or might not hurt them, is an interesting issue. But the point also is that with the third mandate, the president doesn't have a prescribed by law period. I mean, there's no deadline for that. So with some tweaking, you can actually win some time. And even with new elections, you can actually have some meaningful changes in the interim. So that's something to watch in the US. And of course, whether there is this coalition will transpire by the election of the Speaker of Parliament. If they manage to elect a speaker, that will give you some idea about the contours of this ad hoc coalition that might emerge in the next couple of weeks.
Yeah, I was sad to see the president's wife, President Radev's wife, Desislava, suffered an aneurysm at the weekend, and we wish her well in her recovery. I wonder, however, about the formation of a new government, because that's surely also crucial to this. It is about whether the opposition, led by Slavi Trifonov, is going to be able to put a coalition together, given that these parties have all said they don't want anything to do with GERB. They will not form a new government with GERB. And I wonder, do you see the shape of a coalition government emerging yet? Acknowledging that there is always a lot of haggling after elections. We do it now all the time because I guess the two-party system has collapsed almost everywhere in Europe, and we've now got more fragmented parliaments. But we have to be able to see the shape of a new government. And from your perspective, do you see that emerging yet?
I'm losing the connection. Did you ask the question to me or to Dimitar?
Just to you, if you could this time, and it's about whether the opposition is going to be able to cohere sufficiently to form a viable administration, that they're going to have a majority that can be sustained, obviously, so they can pass legislation.
The whole constitutional procedure is extremely interesting, and we do understand how wise, let's say, it was written in the constitution. So the first step, Dimitar explained, of course, let's say, the mandate to the first political force, so GERB. What the public is expecting is to hear some explanations from the GERB why they are not able to form a government. Because from the real moment of the elections till today, so the Prime Minister is always speaking that he's loved by everybody. He will not be the Prime Minister, but he's the best situated. That's the first political force, which is completely true, etc. But why, let's say, they have lost half of the electorate, let's say, from 2009, 1/4, and 3/4 of the public or the voters voted against them, so that they did not address, let's say, this electoral evidence, and the voters do deserve, let's say, some explanation for that. So this is the political challenge, let's say, of the first step. The second step, we are living in a paradoxical situation. The normal situation for any, let's say, mandate is, of course, the support. Shall proposal for government, will it get, let's say, the necessary support? The situation is extremely rare because everybody offers support to Slavi Trifonov. There is no party in the parliament which denied support. There are several paradoxes mixed, let's say. The first, he did not get the mandate. Second, let's say, he did not ask support. But despite that, everybody, the first was Boyko Borisov, who said, I will give you his style, I will give you 10 MPs to vote for your government. Bulgarian Socialist Party will support Slavi Trifonov's government. DPS, the Movement for Rights and Freedoms, will support Slavi Trifonov. There is no party in this parliament which deny support. Everybody declares their support before this support has been asked. So that, how to say, the situation is very paradoxical. We are still, let's say, waiting for the first step, but then, of course, let's say for the second. But okay, is this support sincere? What does it mean? Should it be accepted? It is like a Trojan horse, especially let's say the support of GERB, etc. But simply because it is an analytical webinar, so that we have to be aware of all of the paradoxes of the situation. So that there are so far no, how to say, let's say, no obstacles, let's say, for the formation of the government. And let's say, if we take another perspective, so that there are two possible profiles of this government. One could be minority coalition, so that the three protest parties, and let's say support for different legislations, etc. Another one is to have an expert government, yeah, really with a very specific program with a priority. So health, of course, let's say policy, economic, dealing with the economic crisis, and also revision of the Borisov model, not only government, etc. These are the major priorities. So let's say which type of government Slavi Trifonov intends to propose. It is one of the biggest intrigues. We do not know, but there are two possibilities, and there is declared parliamentary support. And just one small example of yesterday, so that the first proposal of Slavic parties, they still do not openly speak, let's say, to the public, but they do, let's say, political, let's say, activities and negotiations, etc. Let's say, was to remove the opening of the parliament in the old historic building of the parliament, and it is a very small but very interesting detail. Why? First, we are speaking of coalitions. He got immediately the support of all political parties except GERB. So GERB decided to stay in opposition of this act, which could be considered as very symbolic, opening of a new parliament, which is historic in its results in the historic buildings. Okay, just to clarify, probably for some members of the audience, that recently the parliament moved to another building, which is much bigger, much more comfortable, much more suitable also for the, let's say, parliamentary activities, but it is the building of the Communist Party. So symbolically, it is very, very charged, while the historic building is the one, okay, linked, not, yeah, okay, so, okay, just to finish this small example, because there are several lessons to be learned. So first they start with the symbolic politics. They are very good in that. So that, and they, let's say, reorganize, redesign the scene. They are very good professional in that. They got immediately, let's say, support. And they already, how to say, started to define the political agenda. So very small steps, because this is, let's say, what, because according to the constitution, they do not have, let's say, the first voice, so that everybody is asking, Slavi Trifon, why don't you discuss, let's say, your idea, your proposal of the parliament? Okay, but the situation is that if he starts doing that, everybody would start criticizing. Why? The constitution, okay, is clear, so that you would have a second mandate after the first one, so that the first the first round did not even start. So why, let's say, to discuss a second idea? So that not only it looks very easy to create a government, but it is so easy that it is problematic, because if it is supported by everybody, so that, okay, political support is very serious, let's say, commitment, and so should be really negotiated, etc., which support in a way to accept, which probably not, etc. So that, and again, okay, to finish, sorry that I always tend to speak too much, I'm really sorry. So that there are things to be done. The voters declared, let's say, showed very clearly their preferences. There are no indications, let's say, they would change completely, let's say, their preferences, and they gave, let's say, the power, let's say, to the MPs, and it's time to work, and not simply to say, okay, we do not like this parliament, please make to us another one. So that it is there are very serious, let's say, attitudes in the public opinion that it's time to work. It's time, let's say, to pass from politics to policies, and to start, let's say, now we have worked for them. It's time for them to start working for the whole, let's say, nation, and let's say, to do their job.
Thank you so much, Anna. I should say just to our participants that if you would like to ask a question to either Anna or Dimitar, or to raise an issue, you're more than welcome to do that. You can send it through to the questions and answers function, and I will begin now to read some of those questions. But just before that, I just want to turn to Dimitar with two things. It does suggest, even with the fragmentation and even with all the political haggling, house of cards style that we see unfolding, it is more likely than not that Slavi Trifonov will end up as Prime Minister of Bulgaria. And I wonder what you think that presages for the future of Bulgaria. How might such a coalition government actually change Bulgaria? And the other question that I had was just about the performance of far-right parties in the course of the election, because they had a disastrous election. Ataka, Vimro, Mr. Mareshki's party, and so on, failing to reach the 4% threshold. So we saw really the complete defeat of the United Patriots. And I wonder whether that means that they are a spent force in Bulgaria, and that in a way Bulgaria is bucking many of the trends, you know, where populist right-wing parties are concerned.
Well, the second question is easier to answer than the first one. Basically, the answer is no. They have a segment of the electorate which has always supported them. What happened in 2017 was they formed a cartel and maximized their results, whereas now they fell apart and they tried their chances alone, the different factions within the same spectrum, and then pretty much cancelled one another, failing to clear the threshold. But who knows, they might be rational and reform the cartel. I mean, Karakachanov came very close, Vimro came very close to clearing the threshold as well, using a number of issues, including the veto on North Macedonia. So I wouldn't write them off by in any respect. They might be back. Secondly, the stakes in Bulgaria are not just being in parliament, but also clearing the other threshold of 1%, which entitles you to state subsidy.
Yeah,
this gives you life in politics. It gives you the resources to run in further iterations. And if there is a repeat election, who knows what will happen? We are not out of the woods with the far right. More concerningly, their agenda is becoming mainstream, which is not something specific to Bulgaria. You see it in a number of places. What is specific to Bulgaria, however, is that it's not just the center-right buying into such issues, but also for historic reasons, all the main party on the left is totally vulnerable to this sloganeering.
And yes, the BSP has certainly moved in a more conservative direction in recent years.
It's really a move, because they it's been a consistent theme with them. It's just more visible now. Also because parties are outbidding one another on conservative, patriotic issues.
Yeah.
But I would argue that's something that's been there from the very start. This is the party which oversaw the kind of fusion between communism and nationalism since the 1960s.
Yeah.
It's not something that happened under Kornelia Nynova, and it's a problem on the left, obviously. Now, what the government under Slavi Trifonov will look like, going back to your first question, I really don't know. There are lots of people who discount his policy-making skills, that he will be an empty vessel, and by joining the coalition they'll be able to set the agenda. But then again, we remember the same argument in 2009 about Borisov. The established center-right looked at him as the muscle, pun intended, and the body, and they'll be able to dictate his policies. And lo and behold, he managed to outsmart quite a few people, shift alliances, emerge as the decision makers, as opposed to just the flesh of the coalition. Something along those lines may happen with Slavi Trifonov. Although, truth be told, there is no destiny. Societies, political systems evolve and they learned. So history need not repeat itself with Trifonov being the new GERB.
Yeah.
What will happen? We have to see if there's a repeated elections and he comes back even stronger. Then he might be even in a more convenient position to dictate and set his agenda.
Yeah, if they were to move towards 60 seats or beyond, obviously that would strengthen their position in the parliament. I'm going to move to questions now from our audience, beginning with Peter Bankov. And like others, I read Petar's LSE piece about the election before it took place. Peter asks, to what extent is the reliance on EU funding perpetuating the issues with the quality of democracy in Bulgaria? Maybe I'll turn to you, Anna, on this. I remember and recall reading Professor Gana from the United States talking about post-accession hooliganism. He was describing how these groups, which Dimitar referred to earlier, they became so proficient at using European Union funding to support their own private interests, often at the expense of the electorate. So can we really blame the European Union and say it's been asleep at the wheel? Boyko Borisov, I think, has been hugely smart in the way that he has managed relationships within the European Union, with Mrs. Merkel and with other leaders in the EPP. He's rarely attracted any criticism. So doesn't the EU really bear some responsibility for the direction that Bulgaria turned in over the previous sort of 20 years?
Yes and no, but this is a crucial question. This is what this election is all about. So that there is a clear privatization, if I may say, of the European funding. So the state capture is really very clear. Even let's say during pandemic, so when people become much more sensitive. Normal citizens, they do compare, let's say, the funds for the COVID, dealing with COVID, etc., with the policies other countries take, which really reach every citizens, not only businesses, not only big let's say, companies, etc., but every citizen. This is really the major asset of GERB. It's very hard to imagine GERB without European funds. So that's why it's so important that this parliament, how to say, really, let's say, assumes its mandate and so governs a new government. Let's say, takes the state responsibility in its hands. So is Brussels, let's say, complacent? Are they co-responsible for that? Of course, yes. And this ambiguity, let's say, the question mentioned, that if you are not Orban, if you are smiling to everybody, if you accept everything, you do not, let's say, create any tensions, ideological ones, okay, so you can do whatever you want. So citizens really show that they do not want let's say, this to be the game anymore. And so concerning Slavi Trifonov, we really do not know in details his European agenda, so that it is not very clear in the program. Of course, they are pro-European, pro-NATO, etc., but it is not sufficiently probably clear. We do, let's say, expect the policies to prove that. But when, let's say, the public opinion, the electorate says there is a need for the revision of the Borisov model, okay, this concerns, let's say, the European funds, so that they have to reach first a bigger gamut of businesses and let's say much more people, and not to be used for the reproduction of a party, buying these two clienteles I mentioned.
Yeah, thanks so much. I have a question from our colleague, Dr. Jean-Paul Newman, who is in Prague. Good afternoon, Jean-Paul. And it is about the electoral geography of Bulgaria after this election. Anna pointed out earlier that in, I think, 2 out of the 3 Sofia districts, the Democratic Party emerged triumphant. And Jean-Paul's question is about an opening rural-urban divide. I suspect that's already there, but he asks whether in a future scenario, Sofia and Plovdiv and Varna, I guess, vote in one direction, sort of familiar to us from other European jurisdictions, and the rest of the country votes for populist sort of parties of one kind or another, leading to an very unequal Bulgaria. So I wonder, Dimitar, do you see that rural-urban divide there currently? And does the vote for Hristo Ivanov and his colleagues kind of suggest that this is opening up because parts of Bulgaria, as other countries in the EU, are becoming depopulated in rural areas? Most urban areas or big cities and capital cities are doing really well, and Sofia, by any measure, is doing very well. So are we seeing the emergence of a rural-urban divide of significance in Bulgaria?
Well, it's a generic divide in any democratic system, or any political system for that matter, as you pointed out. And if you look at Bulgaria since day one, since the first election in 1990, the divide was very strong. Center-right, anti-communist vote in the big cities, and then the Bulgarian Socialist Party doing very, very well in rural and small town areas. So we've been stuck with it for a long time. Borisov's genius, in a sense, was bridging the divide, because he could galvanize votes in both places, with different messaging, obviously, which testifies to his protean nature as malleable politician. We might get there again, but there's always a caveat, because mobility that Anna talked about. People in rural areas are not stuck in rural areas. And we have lots of out-migration abroad, but also to big cities. Yeah. Sofia is not the same place it was in the 1990s. A lot of those voters are also in the big cities in search of better life chances. So yeah, probably it's not a very good answer, but it depends. It will be there, but it won't matter that profoundly.
I think it's actually much more marked in other neighboring countries. In Romania, for example, the PSD, the Romanian sort of equivalent to the PSP, they do really, really well in rural areas predominantly, and you don't have that sort of GERB protein quality that you described where they can win all over the place. Anna, I think you wanted to come back in here.
Yeah, it is excellent questions. I'm sorry, I do not have the data in front of me, so that I'll make a more general comment. This urban-rural divide was very, very typical at the beginning of the changes. So you described, both of you, etc. It is not so relevant today. These are elections of transition. Sofia, the two electoral districts, they are really an emerging trend, but GERB is keeping very strong positions in all the other, let's say, places. So both the big cities and small cities. So that I would say, but again, I really need, let's say, the data for being more precise, that a more relevant, let's say, factor for these elections is age. Also because when you commented, so you mentioned rural areas, let's say, more populist, but populism is not, how to say, the main challenge of this election. So that very soft populism of Slavi Trifonov, we see a transition from, let's say, extremist nationalists of far-right parties to this affective, I call it affective, let's say, patriotism of Slavi Trifonov, so that it is not a typical, let's say, populist electorate. And so again, I think a more relevant, let's say, factor for the electoral geography for this election is age, with very, very clear three different cases. So the youth massively, youth in Bulgaria, youth abroad, everywhere. So Slavi Trifonov, let's say, no doubt. So seniors, very, very clear Bulgarian Socialist Party. More important percentage of their electorate is 70+. So it's okay. If they do not learn their lessons, okay, so they will disappear very soon. But GERB, very strong positions in all age groups. GERB is still the biggest party in the country. So that concerning GERB, we do not see a clear divide. They are present everywhere. And the rural, it is another question, because I work on migration, so that if there is time, I could introduce a few emerging, let's say, trends, but it does not concern so much these elections.
We have a kind of connected question from Desislava Velcheva, and Desislava asks about the Green Party in Bulgaria. And one of the really interesting things about the European Parliament elections were how well the Greens did, except in Central and Eastern Europe, where the Green phenomenon is really not as significant. However, Desislava asks, by the Green movement gaining 4 seats in Parliament, does this signal a change? Is there a more green sensibility? I guess in some senses, Anna, it's connected to age, the different age cohorts as well, or greater awareness about global warming, the need for sustainability, and so on. I just wonder, are we seeing a green vote emerging potentially in Bulgaria?
Excellent question. Thank you, Desislava, for introducing. So that again, a lot of paradoxes here. Of course, let's say age is important factor, but I would say that the most interesting phenomenon was the greening of activism. So the activism really got green very early in Bulgaria, so that it got green at the real beginning, on the eve of the changes. So the first mobilizations against the communist regime were green mobilizations, ecological mobilizations, but also with the new generation. So the green activism is very innovative, creative, etc. But long years, we face the paradox that, let's say, green generation and green activism and no green representation. Okay, so the first, let's say, to blame are the green political actors, because there have been and still are so many green parties that the green vote really, okay, disappeared as a result. What now the nationalists did, but it was even worse with the green parties. And members of the European Green has visited Bulgaria so many times, asking them, let's say, to unite, asking us, I'm simply professor of political sciences, but also, let's say, active citizen, to do our best. Okay, we say, okay, just to say that there were efforts, but still this is a very visible a sign of lack of maturity, of political maturity and responsibility, let's say, to your voters. So what we see now is something again paradoxical. So the paradox is, let's say, the best analytical, let's say, asset for understanding what is going on in Bulgaria. A coalition which is quite heterogeneous in ideological terms, because, okay, so really, central right party from one side, and the Greens, which are more center left, probably they try to avoid, let's say, this labeling, but more or less. But let's say what unites them is really the anti-corruption agenda and, let's say, very, very clear European, pro-European profile. So I do hope that this is a first step in maturing of the political, let's say, green, because really green activism has excellent roots. Green youth is there. Not only in the cities, okay, of course, mainly in the cities, but also in the rural areas, etc., etc., so that it's up to the politicians to be at the level of the citizens.
I want to turn now to Dimitar in your real expert area, which is broadly geopolitics, I guess, of the region. And two questions that are linked from Jean Crombaugh, who asks or wonders about the degree of Russian interference in this parliamentary election, and wonders whether you could comment on that. And our colleague Andrei Maciak in Bratislava, Andrei asks about foreign policy and whether with the prospect of a new government, we might see a reconstitution of Bulgarian foreign policy. What are relations with Russia, China, and Turkey going to be like? And just as importantly, and there's another linked question on Bulgaria's support for enlargement policy. The last government became a problem in a sense because of its stance on North Macedonia. And again, this questioner asks whether we are likely to see any material difference in the attitude taken by Sofia to the application journey of Skopje.
These are great questions. I don't see a lot of Russian meddling in this election. What is remarkable to me is that in the past two elections, the issue of Russia was much more central.
Yeah.
Maybe overblown, you might argue. But now the issues at stake are very different, and they're also closer to society's agenda. I don't think many Bulgarian voters, even at the height of the Crimean crisis, cared about Russia either way. Sometimes the international perspective on the country exaggerates the foreign policy dimension of those contests. The society is much more into immediate, everyday, but bread and butter matters. And I mean, Borisov, if you look his role in Russia, he has played it both ways depending on the situation. To the center-right core electorate, he posed as a staunchly pro-Western figure, fighting back the socialists who are the genuinely Kremlin Trojan horses. But then again, he was the one who engaged with Putin and with Gazprom, built Turk Stream 2. So trying to use this to wear the mantle of the Russophobe / anti-Russian warrior, which he tried to do with the UDF at some point, but it doesn't play. It doesn't correspond to any deep felt issue with the left. The media in Bulgarian, I would say, is vaguely pro-Russian, but at the same time pro-Western. It's not something that keeps lots of people up at night beyond the pundit class to which I belong as well. Full disclosure. So that's one. Second, I don't expect any major changes in foreign policy. Bulgaria will be busy with itself. You have a COVID situation. You have the whole issue, which we didn't discuss at length, with the recovery funds. And Bulgaria is one of the big beneficiaries of this financial injection. So whoever happens to be in charge of the next government will have their hands full with this agenda, and just maintaining the coalition. So I don't think there'll be much bandwidth for foreign policy issues. I don't know how it will play out with North Macedonia. I might be engaging in some conspiracy theorizing here, for which I beg your pardon, but my sense was that Borisov had an arrangement with Zaev, with whom they always had a very good relationship, to sort it out somehow after the elections. But if the Macedonian strategy was incumbent on GERB being in power and Borisov delivering on his commitments, and to open the parenthesis, he's notorious for backstabbing people and throwing them under the bus. But maybe the Macedonians were better off with Borisov as opposed to a dark horse in power. Slavoj Trifunović is somebody who, in the 90s, kind of capitalized on this nostalgic discourse about Macedonia. He would sing all those songs from the era and so on and so forth. So I'm as clueless as the next person about what Prime Minister Trifonov will do on Macedonia. It might be that he will dig his heels and stick with the veto, which will be a very bad scenario in my book.
Yeah, I agree, but I mean, we should acknowledge that France and the Netherlands are as much a problem where the Western Balkan states are concerned as Bulgaria. But I guess Bulgaria is the regional leader, within that context. So what it does and what it says, I guess, is important. I have another question from Francis Jacobs, our colleague who used to head the European Parliament office in Dublin. And Francis asks about the BSP. And simply put, does the BSP have a future, given that this was a disappointing election result? As Dimitar points out, it wasn't the first by any means in the post-1990 period. But given that GERB had been in power for most of the time since 2009, it really was disappointing to come back with 43 or so seats. And Anna, I wonder if you may speak to this. I know that the executive bureau of the party has resigned, but the BSP leader, Ms. Nikoleva, she's been in power in situ for a short time, and she has a mandate from the members of the party. What do you think is likely to happen to the BSP, whether they go into coalition or not? Your mute button, sorry. We all do it, don't worry.
There are two questions in this one. So what will going to happen to the Bulgarian Socialist Party and what is going to happen to the left part of the political scene? So a major paradox of the political scene in Bulgaria is that the right is overcrowded and the left is empty. Because Dimitar already mentioned this is a conservative party. It is not a left-wing progressive party at all. And let's say this evolution became too visible, let's say, with the new leadership of the leadership of Cornelia Ninova. So he fights all the time against the European socialists led by her predecessors, or Bulgarian leader of the European socialists, etc., etc. So Bulgarian Socialist Party really does not have a socialist agenda, which means that it is a huge empty space, let's say, on the political scene. And it is really, according to me as a political scientist, one of the major enigmas. Why aren't there actors, political actors, let's say, aiming at this political scene? Because we introduced age and youth several times during the debate, but because they are becoming really quite important actor for changing the political scene. And the youth today is not the youth 30 or 20 years ago, not for the universal reasons, but let's say for very political reasons. Let's say people of my generation, or several, let's say, generations after the changes, it was a kind of a shame of being left wing, so that every Democrat was or center right. In most of the post-communist countries, including in Bulgaria, so that all my friends in French universities, okay, so that they are on the left side, so we are on the right. It is so plenty of paradoxes, but today this is not the case anymore. There are more and more youngsters with the left views, like with the green ones, so that there is an electorate which is passive, so that which waits, let's say, for political representation. The electorate is there, but so but there is no offer for that. Okay, this is, let's say, it is not an answer, but the first, let's say, part of the question. The second, will BCP survive? So this hybrid party, so with the socialist name and so conservative, against the Istanbul Convention, against the really terrible, let's say, conservative agenda, does it deserve to survive? I don't know what is the political role, so that they do represent those 65 plus because of loyalty, because they do not read anything, because they have always voted for them, etc., etc. But okay, this will finish in a few years. And so that they do not propose any agenda which is useful for the society, and so that everybody does know. But let's remind again that Bulgaria is the poorest country in the European Union. So many, let's say, inequalities or social injustice, etc. And there is no political voice. So that my wish would be that a real left-wing party emerges to represent, let's say, a progressive agenda, and also to mobilize the existing, let's say, potential of voters. And just one last remark. Again, paradoxically, there are, let's say, this type of left-wing thinking politicians in BCP. There are, and they are educated, and they are outspoken, etc. There are alternatives within the party, but why, let's say, the party does not give them more, let's say, more visibility, more flow? Not easy, let's say, to respond, despite the fact that some of them are also visible. For instance, Krum Zarkov. He's much more moderate, much more open, much more sensitive, reading also academic books. So I was surprised in a meeting in Parliament. He said, "I have read yesterday, Professor Krasteva, one of your articles." I couldn't imagine that, let's say, politicians are doing that. But okay, just yeah, to finish, so that they do have a historic electorate, they will be on the political scene, but they do less and less useful for the society and for their electorate political work.
Thank you very much indeed, Anna. I apologize if I haven't been able to fit in every question that was asked of our speakers. I thank all of our participants for the really interesting questions. And as we draw to the end of this session, I want to particularly thank our speakers, Anna Krasteva and Dimitar Bechev, for giving us a hugely expansive and illuminating insight into the dynamics of the election, what is likely to happen in what I think is a fascinating European Union country. To use the language of the EU, it is the country I know best after my own, I think, given that I know less and less about the United Kingdom every day that goes by with everything that I see happening. So I am really very, very grateful for both of you that you've given us the benefit of your time and your considerable wisdom today in talking about the election. Thank you very much indeed. I'd also like to say thank you to our colleagues, Anne Hamilton-Black and to Orla Dunn, for their stellar work in preparing these sessions and making them work. Thank you very much indeed, Anne and Orla. Thank you to all of our participants for tuning in this afternoon. We hope to see you again soon. But for now, I'll wish you well and say goodbye. Thank you very much indeed.
Bye. Bye.
Bye.
Thank you. Bye.